Listen, we need to talk about color because I feel like that we have all been lied to our entire lives. There's an extremely pervasive myth about color that genuinely held me back in my art. And I'm sure it's holding many of you back as well, so I want to share what I've learned. But just to warn you, this might be a little bit difficult to believe at first. This color wheel is wrong, but just hear me out. So you know that story of that lady who sued McDonald's because her coffee was too hot? If you don't remember, or you live outside of the United States where this story occurred, you may not have heard about it. But at the time when it happened, and for many, many years afterwards, still even to this day, there are people who think about that story and they equate it with frivolous lawsuits. Now, what does this have to do with this myth about color? I'll get back to that in a moment, but just bear with me. But all of society thought that they understood that story, and they thought that this woman must be suing for something that was ridiculous, that was uncalled for. But did you know, turns out that woman at the time was 79 years old. She got third-degree burns over 16% of her body. She had to undergo painful medical treatments, was disabled for a couple years, had to be helped by her family. It was very expensive, very costly. And I'm not a lawyer, but it doesn't sound to me like that was a frivolous lawsuit. But people believe that it was, even to this day. Not to mention the Berenstain Bears. So it's very easy for society as a whole for us to believe certain myths that become pervasive, that everybody understands to be true, even if they're not. Now, getting to color, let me show you something. All right, let's talk about our traditional color wheel. First, we got red on top. And of course, we have our next primary, which is a yellow. We'll put over here. And then we have our third primary, which is blue. And then of course, according to the traditional color wheel, you can combine these, and then we got our green down here, we've got our orange here, and then of course our violet or purple over here. So even from an early age, when we start teaching our kids about color, we are using the traditional color wheel, red, blue, and yellow. We see this over and over again in kids' toys. And even in the books about color, looking up primary colors, color wheel, learning colors, it's all about red, blue, and yellow as the primaries, and even some weird stuff like this. Like, what kind of color wheel is this? Now, that's not to say when we start to teach our kids about color that we've got to be super accurate about the color wheel. We're just teaching them the names of the colors after all, but it just goes to show you that even from a very early age, this idea of the primaries being red, blue, yellow is just driven into us. Hey, real quick, if you're finding this video useful or the other videos on the channel, then make sure you subscribe and hit the like button. It really does help out. But if not, that's okay too. The problem with this color wheel, and it's something that we've known for many, many, many years, is that this color wheel is wrong. Now, this color wheel came about in about the 1700s. It was inspired by Isaac Newton, who in his studies of light showed that there were different colors of light that could be oriented around a wheel. And then around the 1700s, people started grabbing onto that and creating versions of that for painting, for art. And so there was a guy named Harris who came up with a color wheel that probably inspired this one that we still use today, this traditional color wheel that we use today. And that's where we are. But the problem is, again, we've known for many, many years, scientists, designers, people have known for many years that this is not actually accurate, that these are not the true primaries. So if you worked at all in the graphic design industry, you've already probably run across this, and you already know that there are two other color wheels that are used in those industries, whether it's digital design or print design. In digital, we use RGB, which stands for red, green, blue. So red, green, blue become the primaries in that color wheel. And then in print, you would use CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and then the K stands for black. And so in both of those spaces, experts have already acknowledged that the traditional red, blue, yellow color wheel is not correct, is not accurate. Now, this all goes back to the cones in our eyes and the rods and how we see and all of that. And I don't want to get into all that because I don't understand it myself, and because it's not important. It's really only important that we understand that visually speaking, red and cyan, for example, are complementary. That a blue and a yellow are really more complementary than blue and orange. That a purple or violet and a green are actually complementary rather than a violet and a yellow. So as long as we understand that shift in thinking, then it will greatly help our artwork. So the main problem is this traditional color wheel that we've all assumed is correct, even from the toys that we play with and the books that we are given as a child, is incorrect. Now, this may have some value when it comes to color mixing, and you can do some research and look into additive and subtractive mixing and how some of this can be helpful in paint mixing. But listen, I am in the dusty pigment tribe, and we don't care as much about color mixing, although we still have to keep that in mind somewhat. But even if you're mixing colors, it is incredibly important to understand that the way that we visualize color and the color wheel that we see and the primaries that align with that color wheel does not match this traditional color wheel. So in order to make this more accurate, and thinking again about RGB, red, green, blue, or CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and then the K for black, then we need to make some adjustments here. So that would mean that this yellow should actually be green. And that means that this green here should actually be cyan. And then our yellow shifts more on this side, and then we have more of a magenta here. Now, one of the obvious shifts that we see that's happened here is that although we used to consider those typical Christmas colors, that red and green, as primaries, as opposites on the color wheel, they're in fact not opposites on the color wheel. And the opposite of a red is more of a cyan. And so the way that this has changed my painting approach is that I often think in terms of complements, in terms of opposites on the color wheel. And I was always trying to reach for, if I had a red dominant scene or a green dominant scene, I was reaching for what I thought was the opposite or the complement. If I had a lot of foliage, maybe if I threw some red in, that would look nice, and it never did. It didn't work out. Now, that's not to say that you can't make red and green work. They absolutely can. I mean, that's why Christmas colors work together. But they're not the complements, the true complements of each other. And so you have to consider that in your color scheme and when you're thinking about your color harmony. Now let's look at why this matters. First, check out this scene. There's a predominant blue in the water here. And so you want a complement to go with that to make that blue pop a little bit more, to give a little more feel and life to the scene. So in the past, when I thought about the traditional color wheel, I might have paired that blue with an orange, because of course blue and orange are complements. But this blue actually leans more towards cyan. And using what we know now about a proper color wheel, the opposite of cyan would be a red, or I can lighten that and neutralize that some and make it a pink. And so the predominant color behind the blue here in this scene is that muted pink color, that dusty pink color. Now there's still some pops of orange and there's some other colors in here, obviously to give it even more life, but predominantly it's that pink, that muted pink combined with that cyan color. And then in this painting, check out the water and the colors that I chose to use in the water. So again, the water is predominantly a shade of cyan, and I wanted to give a sense of light reflecting and life again to that water. And so I used, rather than an orange, I used a pink again, that dusty pink once again, to bring out that pop, to give that sense of reflecting light and to add more color harmony to the scene. Now that's not to say that you have to use complementary colors in your paintings. You can have a lot of other color schemes, other types of color harmony, but it's important to keep in mind a proper color wheel if you're going to choose the right colors. Now, some of the confusion started for me when I got a color wheel app on my phone, and I opened up the app and there were two different options for color wheels. There was a digital color wheel, it was called, and then there was a traditional color wheel. And it didn't make sense to me, really. Why are there two different color wheels? Just because colors are digital doesn't mean that the color wheel or the primaries or the complements are any different. Why is there difference between digital and what they call traditional color wheel? Well, the real reason I think is because they're just trying to be diplomatic about it. And so instead of saying the correct color wheel versus the wrong color wheel, they say the digital versus the traditional color wheel. But it really comes down to that. One is more accurate than the other in terms of how we experience color. And I know in my own experience, when I was trying to reach for colors and try to choose what's next and trying to learn color harmony and color theory and put that into practice in my work, if I was reaching for two complements that weren't actually complements visually, if I believed they were because I was told they were because the traditional color wheel said they were, and then when I applied them in my painting, if it didn't look right, then I second guessed myself. And I thought, well, that doesn't feel right, that doesn't look right, but that's what the color wheel says, and so I will go with it. But once I learned this distinction, once I learned that those complements weren't actually true from that traditional color wheel, those primaries weren't actually accurate from that traditional color wheel, then that made me second guess myself less when I reached for colors. It made color intuition feel more intuitive, and it brought just a new level to my work, I believe. It made me progress in my use of color much quicker than if I had stuck with that old traditional color wheel. Now, I didn't come up with all these ideas, of course. I was able to learn them from other people who have done all the hard work ahead of me. So I highly recommend that you go look up The Color Nerd on YouTube. Great resource about the history of the color wheels, why they're different, and also how even though the traditional color wheel can inform some aspects of paint mixing, it's not really even helpful for that in many ways. And this also explains why if you pay attention to experienced artists, a lot of times they'll tell you to use more violet if you've got a lot of green in your. Now there are more challenges and problems with how we experience color and the color wheel and how we name colors, but I'll get to those maybe in some future videos. For now, I just want to challenge you with something. First of all, go look up an app on your phone, on your tablet, whatever you use for a painting reference, a color wheel app, and make sure that it's one that has a CMYK or RGB based color wheel. And if you order a physical copy of a color wheel, don't rely on it until you know, is it red, blue, yellow based like the traditional color wheel, or is it red, green, blue, or cyan, magenta, yellow based? Make sure you get a color wheel that's more accurate. And then once you've done that, once you have an understanding or have a reference of a color wheel that is more accurate, then go paint a painting that's a complementary color scheme. Red and cyan, for example, are complements. Go paint a scene with those two colors. Go paint a complementary color scheme scene and see if it makes a difference. See if the colors begin to feel a little more intuitive to you, more natural feeling. See if they feel just a little bit better because you're using more accurate complements in your painting. And most importantly, just go make something.